Hello, everyone. Welcome to Exchange Exposed, a quarterly podcast covering on-premises Exchange, Exchange Online, and related technologies. Exchange Exposed is hosted by Exchange MVPs Tony Redmond and Paul Robichaux.
So welcome, everyone, to the third episode of the Exchange Exposed podcast with Paul Robichaux, that's me, and Tony Redmond.
Hi, guys.
We're excited about this episode of the podcast because one of the things we do at Exchange Exposed is take a little bit of a different view of the exchange world. Rather than trying to get way down in the level of detail that you might expect from a presentation at Ignite or a Chalk Talk session with an MVP or certified master, we try to take a look at the strategic level to figure out everything that's happening in the world of Exchange and Office 365 and talk about why it matters to administrators and designers and the people who have to manage and maintain these systems. In a little bit of a departure from our previous episodes, we've got a special guest today from Microsoft, Kamal Janardhan, who's well known as one of the architects and product managers behind Microsoft's compliance strategy for Office 365 and Exchange. So we've got some really interesting things to ask her, and very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say about what her group has been working on and what she thinks that says about the broader future of compliance in Office 365. Finally, in a programming note, I'm really excited that our podcast is now available on the iTunes, I suppose, music store, podcast store. In any event, if you go to iTunes on your preferred computing device and search for Exchange Exposed, you'll find us and can very easily subscribe so you don't miss any episodes in the future. So with all that out of the way, Tony, let me ask you the question du jour. What do you think about what's going on in Exchange? Let's talk about what's been happening over the last month or two since we recorded our previous episode.
Well, clearly we haven't rehearsed this very well because I thought I was going to ask you that question, but thank you for passing me that ball. So let me turn it back into you to get us back on track and set up something. I mean, we're just in a stage where Exchange 2013's cumulative update 8 has shipped. I went on record by calling it the most boring release ever, and I was just because nothing has gone wrong, touch wood. Nothing continues to go wrong, touch wood again. It just seems that Microsoft have gotten this update right, and nothing much is in it. I mean, there's some stuff. They talk about public folder migration improvements, yada yada, which is nice if you have to migrate across a whole pile of public folders. And my gosh, it's only taken eight releases to get out the web app to acknowledge the existence of public folders that store calendars and contacts. But what I just can't get motivated about it. I mean, what about you? How do you for example, think that their march towards 1 million public folders is anything to shout from the rooftops?
Well, I suppose it depends on whether you view that in terms of the average administrator or the, I hesitate to use the term special snowflake, but public folders.
Interesting term.
Well, public folders are a great example of a technology that really has a binary uptake. There are some organizations that are very heavily dependent on public folders, and so for them, any kind of scalability or performance or capability improvement in that feature area is going to be very interesting to them. For example, the other day on the Exchange 2013 Facebook group, Jason Sherry, a fellow MVP, mentioned that he has a customer who has 26 million public folders. Now, to me, that sounds absurd. I mean, why would you ever want to do that? I couldn't come up with a good reason other than inattention or rampant growth of public folders without any adult supervision. But let's take that number at face value. For a customer who has 26 million public folders, increasing the limit to 1 million folders doesn't really do them any good.
No.
For my customers in particular, if you sum up every customer that I've ever worked with in the Exchange world and added up every public folder that they have or have had, it still wouldn't come to 1 million. So I think for most customers, having 1 million public folders is a non-event. But for the ones who are heavily invested in public folders, there's certainly a segment of customers that will find that interesting. I think the bigger deal, and you can perhaps speak to this from your own background, the bigger deal on being able to say, we support 1 million public folders in the cloud now, is merely as a proof point or an opportunity to brag about scalability. in an area where Microsoft has taken perhaps not a beating, but perhaps a mild walloping in terms of the limitations that their architecture put on things.
Yeah, well, I think that's fair. In fact, I would call it a beating, because anybody who was at the Unplugged session about public folders at the Exchange conference in Austin last April would have recalled that there was quite an amount of passion in the air. Let's put it like that. And there were some pretty hard words said about Microsoft's inability to get the new public folder architecture to scale. Now, to be fair to the engineers, it was a new architecture, and on the surface, it all looked pretty good. I mean, when you think about it, it's a pretty compelling thing to move public folder hierarchy and contents away from the existing public folder databases, which use their own replication model, and put them in the DAG. You get all of the high availability, you get failover, all of that sort of good stuff. Absolutely fantastic. But there's a long way between something that looks great on paper and projects wonderfully when it's on PowerPoint to actually working well in the field, and that's where they fell down. Now they're saying this 1 million limit is there now. Mind you, it's not 1 million, of course, in Office 365, because they're sensible enough to keep it down at, I think, was it 250,000 there. I have a real problem with this million figure. It's conceptually difficult for me to figure out, how do you test 1 million public folders? How do you test the migration of 1 million public folders? How do you test the scalability, the true scalability? Because essentially, if you've got 1 million public folders, how many users are going to be connected to those public folders? So, I think it's a nice number to have. I think it'll give a lot of customers confidence that they can go that high, but I still got some little doubts rattling around in this old brain of mine, and it is an old brain at this stage, so there's plenty of room for things to rattle around in it. And I'm just thinking to myself, gee, scalability to that level, let alone the level that Jason was talking about. I mean, that guy, I just can't even contemplate that.
That's not the audience. The audience for this, I don't think, is customers who genuinely have 1 million public folders or more. The audience is the people who may have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. Microsoft is making a statement that we scale up to 1 million. They're trying to reassure those customers. Now, I think your point is very well taken, that we don't have any idea of what it means to quote unquote support 1 million public folders. Migration is a great example. Okay, fine. You support 1 million public folders. Tell me how I'm going to migrate the contents of my 999,000 on-prem public folders reliably and quickly to the cloud.
Quickly is a very interesting word to use in that context.
Well, in that context, I would wave the flag and say that's about the point where I would insist on having the new Express Route feature to give me direct connectivity into Office 365 deployed.
Yeah, but that's not going to be available until the third quarter of the year. But I mean, more importantly, I think is the fact that if you're dealing with this number of public folders, you've got to look at one very big salient fact which is staring you in the face. Yes, there's lots of data in those public folders. Yes, there's lots of people who use those public folders, because it's got to be, given that there's so many. But yes, also there's a lot of crap in those public folders.
Absolutely.
Because let's face it, public folders have now been in existence for 20 years. I'm taking 1995 as the start, but public folders were there when Exchange 4.0 went into beta, and they've been accumulating ever since. And over 20 years, no matter whether you're dealing with any sort of technology, or even stuff that isn't really technology. I mean, there's, a pipe, a plumbing pipe, it builds up crud and rubbish over 20 years. And the same thing has happened with public folders. I got to believe that if you've got even 50,000 public folders, there's got to be 20%, 25% of those public folders that are absolutely not required any longer. In fact, one of the things I was talking to about with a fellow who has a rather large hierarchy the other day, he said, you know what? Yeah, our numbers look really big, but we've got such a big tree that we've got lots and lots of different levels, and each one of those levels has got lots of public folders, but they're only really nodes that lead us on to other levels. So you've got this extraordinarily complex public folder structure that goes 16 levels deep. And if you strip away all of the public folders that are simply containing nothing but references to other public folders, subfolders, we're actually not that bad. So I think what this means to me is that if anybody has got these ginormous numbers of public folders, it's just a big wake up call. It's like, this is cleanup time. It's probably once in a 5-year opportunity to go clean house and figure out, do we need all this junk? Number one. And if so, is moving it to public folders and Office 365 or Exchange 2013 the right choice? Because there are other options to store this kind of data.
I think that's a really good point, and that's one that you and I are going to want to touch on a little later when we start talking about Office 365 groups. Because one of the things we had planned to talk about was sort of the difference in viewpoint that you see between Exchange admins and people who are responsible for content management or governance.
Yeah.
But on that same note about, do we really need all these things? Let's pivot and let's talk about what's coming up for Ignite. Microsoft has released the session list and the speaker list for Ignite, and it's interesting reading the tea leaves. For those of our listeners who remember the Kremlin, we can engage in a little bit of Kremlinology by looking at the session list and try to figure out what Microsoft is telling us with these sessions. What do you think?
What do I think? Well, the first thing is that anybody who believed that it's going to be Mech Lite or even Mech Better or Mega Mech is going to be disappointed. There are 80 Exchange sessions on the list, but there's a lot of duplications. So there's a huge amount of overlap. So when you strip it away and you focus on the pure Exchange sessions, pure Exchange on-prem sessions, pure Exchange on-prem the next release sessions, it's a different matter. The numbers don't lie. They're much smaller. Now, that being said, two things I think have got to happen. Firstly, Microsoft have got to confirm the final schedule. They're still tweaking. The second thing is they've got to show us the agenda. And the agenda will strip away all the duplications, and it will show us how they're building a story within Ignite. Because, if you got, for example, a 2016 overview, followed by an architecture session, followed by a migration session, followed by here's a great new feature session, well, you can see how that's a story. That hangs together. And that's one way of presenting it. Another way of presenting it is that they have little islands of 2016 dotted around the place. A third way of presenting it would be to have a 2016 keynote, which I don't believe they're going to have. So I think we've got to wait and see the final schedule. I think we've got to wait and see the final agenda. And I think out of that we'll be able to tell just what weight and importance Microsoft is really given to the future of on-prem Exchange. Right now, to use your term, reading the tea leaves, I'd say that, yeah, there's 2016 content there. Yes, you will find out about the next version of Exchange if you go to Ignite. Yes, you will find out some technical details about the architecture and what to expect when Microsoft ships 2016 towards the end of this year, probably in late October if all of the previous Office release cycles for the last couple of versions follow through. But whether you're going to be, as we say here in Ireland, excited and delighted by the content, a massive new features and stuff like that, I don't know. I think what you're going to probably see is that you're going to see some tweaking to the architecture. A lot of that will be due to the need to support the massive scalability that they have in Office 365. I think certainly you'll see some effort to support whatever new versions of Windows are coming along the line. I think you'll see some new automation features probably because they're needed in Office 365. But whether you're going to see radical new functionality, I mean, we already know that the keynote functionality that you see in Office 365 that have been introduced over the last while, like Delve and Office 365 groups, are not going to be there because Microsoft has said point blank they're not going to be there. So it's just going to be interesting to see the reaction that people have to probably the first major new version of Exchange in 20 years that has no major headline new features built into it. That's what I think we're going to see. But, I mean, that's my view. Well, there's only one view. And as, I could be wrong.
Well, I wonder, you wrote a column not long ago in which you said CU8 was, I believe you used the word boring.
Yes, and I hold to it.
And excuse me.
That's all
I
right.
happen to
Well, it
think
wasn't that boring.
no, sorry, it's pollen season here in Alabama. I happen to like bug fixes. It's true that they're not exciting, but I'm almost always grateful to have them, except when they introduce regressions. So I think there is something to be said if you look at Exchange 2016 as an opportunity for Microsoft to build on what they've already got and to introduce some incremental improvements in areas where those improvements would make sense. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. One of the topics we've been batting around here is what it means to be the dominant player in a market. And I think it's fair to say, and you and I have talked about this before over beer, it's fair to say that Microsoft owns the enterprise email market. They have no serious competitors for Exchange, although there are certainly serious competitors in the cloud services realm. Amazon is mounting a challenge with workplace mail. Of course, Google
It's not going to go anywhere. Not going to go anywhere.
Well, Microsoft can't afford to make that assumption.
I know they can't, but I mean, I think Amazon's barking up a tree that it's not going to win. You know, I just think they don't know the enterprise, number one, and they don't know how to deliver services, number two, and they don't know how to deliver a service on an international basis, number three.
I can't speak to the international services part merely because I haven't done it, but I assure you, having worked with Amazon Web Services, they most certainly do know how to excel at services delivery.
Yeah, no, service is different than services. Service delivery, they absolutely can do. They can make a service available like AWS. Services is all the ecosystem that surrounds the delivery of that service. If you think of it, one of the really big competitive advantages, Microsoft has two major competitive advantages in the email market when it comes to the enterprise in the cloud space. The first is they've got hybrid connectivity. That's the jewel in their crown. It means that the enterprises can keep part of the workload on premises and part of the workload in the cloud. Google can't do that. Amazon won't be able to do that. The second thing, and it may be actually the more important thing, is they've got the ecosystem that's built up around Exchange in the last 20 years. And that the ecosystem is not only third-party products, it's the level of understanding that people have, it's the sense of maturity within the Microsoft operation itself, you know, their people, their TAMs, their corporate account managers, all that kind of stuff. And it just takes an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of talent, an enormous amount of dedication to get that ecosystem built. Google doesn't have it. They really don't. And they've been at this for 7 or 8 years. And Amazon won't have it either. So that's where I think they're going to run into a huge iceberg.
Food. I'm nodding and thinking, but since this is not the Amazon Workplace Mail,
let's go talk about something else.
Let's talk about Exchange. And you know, one other note I want to throw in before we move off the topic of Ignite is that at TechEd, historically in years past, there have been between 30 and 40 dedicated Exchange sessions. So that's useful as a metric to put into context how many sessions we're getting at Ignite versus how many we would have gotten at a nominal TechEd 2016.
And what do we have at MEC? 125, 126?
Easily.
Yeah, so there you go. Anyway, let me ask you, just looking, I said I made a fairly radical statement in the eyes of some, I guess, that Exchange 2016 could be the first major release of the product in 20 years that doesn't have a headline new feature, a standout feature in it. Yet Office 365 has all these features like Delve, clutter, and groups. Why do you think that we're not going to see this in an on-prem environment?
Well, the answer is complicated, as are these features. I think ultimately, if you were to boil it down into a sentence that you could share in an elevator with a potential customer or somebody else where you wanted to get right to the heart of the matter, it is that these features introduce a degree of infrastructure complexity and interrelation between products that most on-prem customers are not willing or able to embrace right now. Let me give you an example from a headline feature that was touted in Exchange 2013. Site mailboxes. Great idea. Microsoft made a huge amount of noise around how great site mailboxes were going to be, and yet they are very thin on the ground in Exchange 2013 deployments because they're poorly understood, they're complicated to deploy and use, and they require investment in SharePoint. Now, it's a little odd. I work for a company whose primary claim to fame over the years has been its competency in SharePoint. But people who have SharePoint deployed and people who want to use site mailboxes are two pretty much non-overlapping groups as far as I can tell. So I think if you look at site mailboxes as a model of a feature that was highly touted, maybe not a headline feature, maybe
Oh no, it was a new frontier for collaboration. I was told at one stage.
Well,
it was there. You go.
It was yet another in the list of things that were going to replace public folders, if I remember right.
Yeah, well, there have been a few of those, so
and more to come.
More to come.
Site mailboxes are a great example of a feature that was heavily promoted as something that was going to be awesome, and that customers, for various reasons, did not widely adopt. I think Microsoft learned something from that, and part of what they learned is that in looking at a feature, if you look at the major Office 365 features that we have gotten, I think you can divide them into two groups. There are some features that are completely dependent on back-end infrastructure that customers can't replicate themselves.
Right.
Yammer integration would be a great example of this. There is no on-prem version of Yammer. There never will be. It doesn't make any sense to spend engineering effort to integrate with a service that is only cloud-based, such as Yammer. Totally get that. On the other hand, you have features that feasibly could be implemented on-prem, and I think Clutter is a good example there, because one of the intriguing things about Clutter is that it's machine learning driven, and it's supposedly driven by your interactions with your email. So, at least in theory, the possibility exists that Microsoft could say, all right, we're going to carve out this section of the inference engine and the other components that power Clutter, and either we're going to make it a service like Active Directory rights management services that you can subscribe to in the cloud and use in hybrid mode, or we're going to package it as a standalone feature. The problem is that if they package it as a standalone on-prem feature, it's one more thing that requires server infrastructure and training and debugging.
But I think there's another thing there too, Paul. Even with Clutter depends on constant tweaking of algorithms. And, Microsoft is getting better at pushing out updates. I mean, you can get, for example, a regular daily update for antivirus from Microsoft.
Right.
So it is possible that you could push out the new algorithm for Clutter every day as they tweak it to make it much better. But I just think that the problem that we face in an on-prem environment is simply put as this. On-prem IT departments have no appetite for the type of massive integration and management commitment that's required to make some of this stuff work. I think that's it in a nutshell. Delve and groups are poster childs for this. I mean, if you think of Delve depends on the Office graph. Delve depends on a whole pile of signals coming in from all the different products, and all those products have got to be running exactly the right version, and they've got to be configured in exactly the right way. I mean, you mentioned site mailboxes. The biggest pain that site mailboxes had was setting up the configuration to allow Exchange to synchronize data to SharePoint and SharePoint to synchronize back to Exchange. It was fragile, it was complex, it was error prone, and it failed a lot. Same type of thing with all these feeds and speeds into Delve. If you look at groups, same type of thing. It depends on a number of different components. You've got now the latest thing that they've added is a OneNote notebook, shared OneNote notebook. Fantastic. The only reason they were able to add that in is it's an Office component. It's hanging around. They can make it available through OneNote Online. Bang, in it goes. Try doing that now in an on-prem environment. And they've already got substantial complexity in Office 365 groups with the group mailbox coming from Exchange and this group document library, which comes from SharePoint, but it's presented as OneDrive for Business for all sorts of different reasons. That type of level of software engineering and integration, can you imagine getting a 200-point, this is what you've got to do to make this all work document from Microsoft? Can you imagine the horrendous support that would be required? I mean, you're not talking about something like a wizard running to put all this stuff together. I think a wizard could run to put it all together initially, but to keep it going as Exchange gets patched with a cumulative update, as SharePoint gets patched, as Windows gets patched, as other bits get patched, it's just incredible. So what I see happening here is the fact that the most recent new developments that we see in Office 365 are a different generation of software technology than the sheer cloud enabling of products like Exchange and SharePoint. Where in the past we were just taking these products like Exchange, like SharePoint, bringing them to the cloud and saying, okay, we've got to make some changes to make them run in this massive multi-tenant environment. Okay, that's what happened over Exchange 2010, Exchange 2013. Now what's happening is that they've got all of this integration done. They've got all these components together, and it's almost like going when they want to build a new feature. It's like looking around, what's in the Office parts bin that we can use? Oh, we can take a mailbox from Exchange. That's fine. Well, we can take a document library from SharePoint. That's fine. Well, we can take this bit over here, and we can take that bit over there, and we put them all together. That's a new feature, and that's impossible, I think, to deliver on-prem. And that, to me, is the reason why I'm looking at these features and saying, I'm never going to see these. And if we do see them, if we do see something labeled as such, I think it's going to be a poor shadow of what we have in Office 365. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think you're absolutely right about complexity. And the interesting aspect of that to me is this is a flip side of what we've seen from Microsoft over really starting with Exchange 2010, but much more vividly now. Microsoft has the preferred architecture in which they preach simplicity. Reduce the number of namespaces you support wherever you possibly can. Reduce the amount of infrastructure support that you have to have. Get rid of your well, I shouldn't say they are advocating getting rid of SANs. What they're saying instead is that you can run a robust infrastructure using JBOD. They have specific guidelines around the specific things that they want to see people doing in the preferred architecture to cut down the amount of complexity in the environment. And so if the price of having these features on-prem is to throw all that in the waste can and say, well, we know we told you should simplify your environment as much as possible, but now we want you to recomplicate it by adding these new server roles and new relationships between components and new dependencies. And I think absolutely that's not going to happen.
Yeah. So speaking of, taking stuff and rebranding it a little and all the rest of it, and putting it out as a poor version of itself, what do you think about the rebranding exercise that's been happening around Outlook for iOS and Android and all of that?
It's really interesting to see the way that those products are being integrated into big Microsoft. Mm-hmm. One of the things that it took me a long time to learn when I first started running and swimming seriously is that there are really only two ways to go faster. You can cover more distance with each step or with each swim stroke, or you can increase the cadence at which you run or swim. Mm-hmm. Microsoft has very clearly decided that they're moving away from this model of trying to cover more ground in each step and instead increase the cadence that they reach these steps at. So there's a huge disconnect still between the cadence of Windows, the cadence of Exchange, the cadence of client applications on the desktop, and the client or the mobile client experience. Lync/Skype for Business, I think, has trailblazed this a little bit because we've seen them very successfully, I think, decouple updating the server from updating the mobile clients. There have been multiple updates to all of the Lync mobile clients since they first started to ship on a much quicker cadence than we've seen Lync server updates. Mm. Now the Exchange folks are in that same business. We're still going to get server updates at some cadence. We still will have cumulative updates however they're labeled, whether they're CUs or service packs. But the mobile client folks have apparently decided that a 7 to 28 day release cadence is just about right for them, and that seems to be what they're aiming for.
Which is reasonable enough given what's required in the market these days. I find it. I saw a note today from I think Javier, the general manager of the Outlook Apps team. He tweeted something today to say that they're really making big strides in getting off Amazon Web Services and getting over to Azure. I'm sure that's going to be a big thing for them, because that's one of the major hang-ups that I think a lot of people have right now with the way these apps work. They don't like, for example, the data being split across Amazon Web Services and Microsoft. It gives them two potential, security potential violations or holes where things could be exploited. But I think it also gives them additional management problems, because you've got one set of IP addresses coming in from AWS that you may have to manage through firewalls, and you have another set that might be coming in from Office 365. So get them all onto the one platform would be a good thing. But I also think that once they get it onto AWS or Azure, they'll be able to really make much better use of the data they seem to be manipulating to build this focused inbox that they've got going, and also to maybe even get some more integration going with the likes of Calendar, maybe to exploit some of the other new features that are coming on in the service. And it will be, I think it'll be really, really interesting to see how these Outlook apps develop over the next 6 months using this rapid cadence that they've got. Now, the question I have, maybe you'd have a view on this, is whether or not that rapid cadence is going to get them to a point very quickly in the next, let's say, 4 to 6 months, where you can look at the Outlook apps and say, yeah, I'd recommend those for enterprise deployment, and specifically for enterprises that are worried about security, worried about manageability, they're worried about functionality, they're worried about being able to deploy clients and manage clients on devices for tens of thousands of users. I mean, do you think we're going to get to that stage? Because I don't think we're at it now.
I don't think we're at it now with these apps. And I guess before I answer that, I want to take mild exception to something you just said about the move from AWS to Azure. I think that it is true that there are a lot of benefits for the Outlook team in moving from AWS onto Azure. I think the big benefit for customers is that when all that data and all those component services are running under the same privacy policies and with the same SLAs that Microsoft offers its other services, that's good for customers.
And they're confined from a European perspective when the data is restricted in region or in country, which Microsoft can do and Amazon really